For most of a submarine's active life, it's invisible to the general public. That's because it's under the sea on operations, or it's docked in a military facility. When a submarine reaches the end of its active life, it's decommissioned and then scrapped. There are exceptions to every rule, though, and we have plenty of those exceptions in this fantastic video of abandoned submarines. The Submarine Explorer, built by Julius H. Kroll in New York in 1866, was a ship years ahead of its time. The idea of a vessel that could both dive and resurface under its own power was considered fanciful in the 19th century, but Kroll and his team managed to get it working. It wasn't perfect. Those who traveled in it often complained of decompression sickness, but it was an important leap forward in maritime technology. Despite that, it only lasted for 3 years. The Explorer had been taken to Panama to harvest pearls and oysters from the appropriately named Pearl Islands, but the problems with decompression sickness continued, and the already overfished pearl beds didn't yield quite as much as had been hoped. Eventually, the vessel developed a reputation for making everyone who served in it seriously ill, and so in 1869 it surfaced for the last time and was left on the beach. It's still there now, although it's showing the effects of age and exposure and may not last much longer. A historically important ship like this should be afforded protected status, but sadly the Submarine Explorer isn't getting any protection. The U-352 is a Type 8C German U-boat, 220 feet long and 20 feet wide. It was built in 1940 in Flensburg as part of the ill-fated German war effort. The U-boat had a fairly uneventful military career until May 1942, when it became the first German U-boat to be sunk by the United States Coast Guard. The vessel was close to the American East Coast during the time, and was sunk by the USCGC Icarus as part of the Battle of the Atlantic. The wreck of the U-352 can be found just south of Cape Hatteras in calm, warm Gulf Stream water, which makes it one of the most popular wreck sites for the area's many divers. The vessel is mostly in one piece and has developed an entire marine ecosystem. The hull of the U-boat is encrusted with algae and has been noted to support sea anemones and a variety of corals. So many amberjack and red barbier baitfish swim around the wreck that it's sometimes difficult to obtain clear photographs of it. Experts say that the wreck is in a stable condition and might survive for several centuries, barring accidents. Speaking of significant shipwrecks, here's the USS Ling submarine in Hackensack, New Jersey, USA. The 312-foot-long submarine is a relic of the Second World War, but her service during the war was brief and insignificant. In fact, she didn't do much at sea at all. She's far more notable for what happened after her retirement. She spent a brief time as a training vessel in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but was then permanently berthed close to the New Jersey Naval Museum, where she underwent a full restoration and was open to the public as a museum. That's where she stayed until 2012, when Hurricane Sandy ripped through the area. Aside from being shifted from her berth, the USS Ling was severely damaged by the storm and has never reopened in the 8 years since. Its current location has become a bone of contention. As it's on the river, it isn't the property of the city. It's no longer on the property of the family that owns the land the rest of the museum is built on either. The U.S. Navy has declined to take ownership of it, and the museum doesn't have the capital to move or restore it. It looks like it's going to stay there for a while. Nuclear submarines are designed to be dangerous, but when a fire breaks out on board, they're as much a danger to themselves as anybody else. Normally, that isn't an issue, because submarines are underwater, but the Russian Navy submarine K-84 Ekaterinburg was in dry dock when she mysteriously burst into flame in December 2011. Fortunately, her deadly weapons weren't on board at the time. K-84 was being repaired in Murmansk when a careless welder allowed sparks to ignite wooden scaffolds around the ship, which in turn set fire to the rubber coating on the hull. Conventional firefighting approaches couldn't control the blaze, and so she was eventually partially sunk to put the fires out. It's believed no radiation leakage occurred. Had the weapons not been removed before repair work had begun, Russia would have been at risk of the most significant nuclear accident since Chernobyl. It cost over $15 million to repair the damaged submarine, which eventually returned to the fleet in full working order 3 years after the incident. She remains in service, but she's currently listed as being inactive and is thought to be scheduled for formal decommissioning. The HMAS Otama is a submarine with a secret. The Oberon-class submarine spent its entire military career with the Royal Australian Navy, but was actually built in Scotland. She was the last vessel of her class ever to be built, and was launched in December 1975. The purpose she served in the Navy was once top secret, so much so that the crews of the Royal Australian Navy vessels referred to her as the Mystery Boat. We now know that she was fitted with intelligence gathering and surveillance equipment, and spent most of her time monitoring Soviet Pacific Fleet vessels and Chinese Navy vessels. After being decommissioned in 2000, she was sold to a private firm a year later, with a plan to be turned into a museum vessel. However, her owners struggled to get planning permission to have her permanently moored anywhere. They eventually tried to sell the submarine on eBay in 2008, which made headlines around the world, but a buyer couldn't be found. She's been in limbo ever since, with the most recent plan to turn her into a museum rejected by authorities in 2013. When we talk about German U-boats, we're usually talking about the Second World War. That isn't where the U-boats made their debut in the theater of conflict, though. U-boats were also a problem for Allied forces, and especially British forces, during the First World War. Back then, they were far more advanced than any maritime vehicle any other country owned or operated, and so it's no wonder that Britain insisted that Germany handed them all over after the war came to an end. One such surrendered vessel is the UB-122, which has spent more than a century trapped in mudflats in the River Medway in Kent, close to England's south coast. It's thought that the tow rope attached to the U-boat snapped, and the UB-122 ran aground and proved impossible to shift. Although the mudflats have done an excellent job of holding the vessel in place, they might have done an even more remarkable job of preserving it. Every time the tide goes out, it's possible to catch a glimpse of the whole ship, and it's still in one piece after all this time. The wreck is too delicate to move now, though, even if someone wanted to. Taking apart a submarine isn't easy. Taking apart a nuclear submarine is even harder because of the risks involved. There's a place in England that knows all about that. Davenport Naval Base in Plymouth has become a hub for decommissioning nuclear submarines, and in June 2019, the facility warned the UK government that it's at capacity. Technically speaking, the base is allowed to hold 12 nuclear submarines at a time, with an overflow capacity for 2 more. The same year it sent out the warning, the Ministry of Defense unsuccessfully applied for permission to store a further 4 decommissioned Trafalgar-class nuclear submarines there. With the request rejected, the fate of the 4 British submarines is unclear. Catastrophically, the facility is 11 years behind schedule in terms of defueling the boats, and 15 years behind with taking them apart. Its permission to defuel subs was temporarily revoked after a breach of nuclear safety standards in 2004, which had a knock-on effect ever since. The most worrying aspect of that knock-on effect is that it means not one of the 20 nuclear subs that have been taken out of service since the 1980s has been fully dismantled. We suspect that most people had never thought of building a yellow submarine before the Beatles sang about it in the 1960s. We've seen quite a few since then, including the one trapped in Coney Island Creek in New York City. It's been there for so long that it's hard to identify it as being yellow anymore. Time, weathering, and rust have turned it orange. The vessel is called Questor I and was a labor of love for Jerry Bianco, when he built it as a one-man project in 1967. Jerry had a strange mission in mind for Questor I. He made his boat from salvaged materials and intended to use it to salvage materials from the SS Andrea Doria. The Italian liner sank near Nantucket Sound in the late 1950s and was thought to be full of valuables when it went down. The attempt was both a disaster and an embarrassment. The crane lowering the Questor I into the water made an error and dropped Questor I sideways onto a mudbank. It later transpired that the boat didn't contain enough ballast, which partially explains why it couldn't subsequently be freed. The ship was eventually freed from its sticky situation by a storm in 1981, but it drifted away and then partially sank. We've shown you a submarine base in England, and now here's one in Crimea. It's a formerly top-secret Soviet submarine base, the existence of which was so classified that it remained hidden from the public for decades. 2003 saw a reversal in that position, with the base now open as a museum to anybody who wants to see it. The base is in the Crimean peninsula of Balaclava and was believed by those who built it to be indestructible. The people who worked here were told they'd be safe even in the event of a nuclear bomb strike. The base's location was chosen specifically because it can't be seen from the open sea. There have been military ports in Balaclava for several centuries for the same reason. Work on the facility was completed in 1957 during the height of the Cold War, during which making expensive bases under 400 feet of solid rock was seen as not only wise but necessary. Its original purpose was to serve as a repair center for ships from the USSR's Black Sea Fleet, but that was quickly changed to submarine storage. We may never know the full extent of what went on here, but it was considered so important that it continued beyond the fall of the Soviet Union. The decommissioning process didn't begin until 1993. The Bay of Biscay, which is between the north coast of Spain and the west coast of France, is known for its violent storms and rough seas. As dangerous as conditions can be on the surface of the water, there's something far more dangerous lurking 15,000 feet beneath it. On April 12, 1970, the November-class Soviet nuclear submarine K-8 sank in the Bay of Biscay, with all of its nuclear weapons still on board. A fire had broken out aboard the submarine at the time of its sinking, and had begun to spread through the air conditioning system. The crew managed to shut down both of the nuclear reactors aboard the ship, but were then trapped aboard when compartments were closed in an attempt to control the fire. Some of them eventually succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning, but 73 survived and were rescued after 80 hours aboard the stricken vessel. Given the extent of the damage to the K-8, it was decided that a rescue mission was impossible. That means there's a badly damaged nuclear submarine with theoretically viable nuclear missiles slowly decaying at the bottom of the sea. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is one of the most notorious military incidents in American history. It's often portrayed as a Japanese sneak attack in which Japanese forces pounced and then escaped before the Americans could respond, but that doesn't reflect the reality of the incident. The Japanese midget submarine HA-19 is evidence of that. It's a Type Eiko Hyoteki class midget submarine that was supposed to enter Pearl Harbor and unleash 2 torpedoes at American Navy warships on December 7, 1941. Apparently, the plan was to scuttle the disposable submarine with explosives as soon as the job was done. However, the crew of the submarine was incompetent. They failed to get into the harbor because of navigational errors and then ran aground, where the submarine was captured by the Americans. It was the first vessel of its kind that the Americans had ever seen, and so it alerted them to the possibility of sneak attacks from small, hard-to-detect vessels. After studying the ship, the U.S. Navy sent it around the country in war bond tours and then turned her into a museum exhibit. She's still on display in the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas today. Our last submarine, U-475, was a Soviet Navy submarine built with the Cold War in mind, but it ended up in a very unlikely location. The submarine, also known by the nickname Black Widow, is currently moored close to Strood on the River Medway in England. The Black Widow is a Soviet Project 641 class submarine and is one of 74 that are known to have been completed by the Soviet Navy between 1957 and 1983. This particular vessel was launched in December 1966 and served for almost 30 years before being decommissioned in 1993. It spent most of those years as part of the Soviet Baltic Fleet, but was primarily used as a training vessel towards the end of its operational life. The Russian Navy sold the submarine to a private buyer in England, who turned it into a museum ship, originally moored close to the Thames Barrier. It would later be moved to Folkestone in 1998, and then moved again to its current location in 2004. As you can see from these images, the Black Widow is now in a state of severe dilapidation and can no longer function as a museum. It's supposed to be scheduled for restoration work, but judging by the state of the vessel, it may already be too late for that. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!